Not on military channels. Not on civilian emergency frequencies. On every screen, across every ship, in both fleets simultaneously, 3 words appeared in clean, clear text, translated perfectly into every language spoken in the war zone. Humanity has arrived. For a long moment, no one breathed. The word itself was almost mythological. Humanity, a species from a small, unremarkable system on the outer spiral arm of the galaxy, a civilization so young that the Vaelthari had already mapped the cosmos by the time humanity's ancestors learned to walk upright. They had been observed, catalogued, and largely ignored. They were considered interesting in the way that young species often were, creative, chaotic, prone to making the same catastrophic mistakes as every civilization before them. The broader galactic community had fully expected them to destroy themselves within a few centuries. And yet, here they were, and for the first time in 50 years, both fleets fell completely silent. The silence lasted less than 4 minutes. Then a warning signal lit up across multiple tactical displays. New contacts entering the combat zone. Not warships. Civilian transports. Hundreds of them. Engines strained beyond safe limits, broadcasting distress signals in 17 languages. They were fleeing from a nearby inhabited system that had been scheduled for bombardment within the hour. Their jump drives had failed. Their sublight engines were failing. They would not clear the battle zone before the assault began. Protocol in both fleets was clear. The battle would continue. Collateral casualties were an accepted and documented consequence of large-scale military operations. The math was simple. Allowing the battle to be disrupted would cost more lives in the long run. The human fleet moved before either command deck could finish articulating that logic. The dark ship spread apart in perfect, practice formation, gliding smoothly between the failing civilian transports and the approaching war fleets. There was no aggression in the movement, no posturing. They were simply placing themselves in the way. Human ships formed a barrier, a wall of patient, silent ships standing between hundreds of thousands of refugees and the weapon systems targeting everything in their vicinity. On the bridge of the Vaelthari command vessel, the fleet admiral stared at the display for a long moment before speaking. Are they shielding civilians? It appears so, Admiral. This is a war zone. Remove them. Weapons powered up again across both fleets. Lock indicators bloomed across tactical screens. Before a single trigger could be pulled, a second transmission burst through every military channel in the combat zone. Not words this time. Star maps. Meticulously calculated navigation routes. Safe corridors through the minefield of debris and military assets. Clear paths leading the civilian fleet entirely away from the battle zone and into neutral space. The calculations were extraordinary. The routes accounted for mine placements that hadn't been publicly logged, ambush vectors from positions that hadn't been officially reported, pursuit lanes that relied on tactical information from both sides of the conflict. Someone in the Dresh fleet broke the silence on an open channel, their synthesized voice barely above a whisper. They know our positions. Both of ours. Every single one. A Vaelthari tactical officer stared at his screen. How long had they been watching us? No one had an answer. The civilian transports, guided by the human fleet star maps, began moving along the provided corridors. The human ships moved with them, not leading, not driving, simply accompanying, maintaining the barrier. The ancient war machines arrived exactly then, as if the universe had a dark sense of timing. They tore through the edges of the combat zone from hyperspace, hundreds of automated drones, weapons already at full charge, targeting algorithms sweeping for heat signatures and energy emissions. They found them immediately. The refugees were directly in their path, and the machines did not differentiate. They began their approach run. The human fleet stopped escorting the civilians. They turned to face the drones. 300 automated war machines, relics of a forgotten apocalypse, charged toward 30 human vessels that had no visible weapon systems, had demonstrated no military aggression, and had not once raised what any scanner would recognize as a defensive shield. On 1,000 bridges across 2 warring fleets, beings who had spent decades becoming numb to horror found themselves holding their breath. The first drone fired. The beam was a weapon so old its design predated the current galactic age, a coherent energy lance powerful enough to split a capital ship in half. It struck the leading human vessel dead center, and the ship absorbed it, The hull flared white gold for a single brilliant second, the energy spreading across the ship's surface in rippling waves before dissipating into nothing. No explosion, no hull breach, no debris. The human ship didn't even alter its course. Then came the second shot, the third. Dozens of drones opened fire simultaneously, and the human formation held, the energy washing over them like water over stone, magnificent and terrible and utterly impossible by every known law of weapon physics. The humans had not shielded themselves from the attacks. They had simply decided, on some fundamental level, not to be harmed by them. Then the humans responded, but not the way anyone expected. Their ships released pulses, soft, almost gentle in their visual signature compared to the savage exchanges of 50 years of galactic war. The pulses moved through the drone formation without destroying a single unit. Instead, one by one, the ancient machines simply stopped. Their weapons locked in their extended position. Their engines cut to silence. Their targeting systems went dark. Not damaged, not destroyed. Disabled with what appeared to be surgical, almost respectful precision. Within 4 minutes, 300 war machines that had survived civilization-ending conflict across multiple galactic ages were floating motionless in space, completely innate, without a single explosion, without a single casualty. The combat zone was so quiet that open channels carried only the sound of breathing. A young tactical officer aboard a Dresh vessel broke the silence first. Her voice carried the particular quality of someone speaking a thought they hadn't meant to say aloud. They could have done that to us. At any point. They could have done that to all of us. No one contradicted her, because everyone, across both fleets, had already reached the same conclusion. The humans hadn't come into the combat zone with 30 ships because that was all they had. They had come with 30 ships because 30 was more than enough. The meeting happened aboard a neutral station, a Vaelthari deep space observatory that had managed, through a combination of luck and strategic irrelevance, to survive the war intact. The station's original purpose had been to study the birth of stars. Now its main conference chamber held the most powerful military and political leaders from both warring factions, summoned not by force but by the simple, unspoken understanding that they had run out of alternatives. The humans sent one representative. She walked into the conference chamber alone, without guards, without weapons, without the ceremonial trappings that every other delegation had used to project power. She was unremarkable in her appearance, which somehow made her more unsettling. She sat down at the center of the table, looked around the room at beings who collectively commanded the firepower to sterilize entire star systems, and waited calmly for the silence to become comfortable. It never quite did. She spoke first. "We didn't come here to conquer you. We came here to save you. Those are very different things, and I want to make sure we're clear about that from the beginning, because everything I'm going to say depends on you understanding the distinction." The Vaelthari Grand Coordinator, an ancient being whose crystalline form refracted the light of the station's interior into constant shifting rainbows, leaned forward slightly. "You disabled our weapons. You demonstrated capabilities we cannot explain. You have been watching this conflict without revealing yourselves. You will forgive us if we find your intentions difficult to take at face value." "That's fair," she said simply. "So let me tell you the truth without dressing it up. You were not fighting for victory anymore. You stopped fighting for victory a long time ago. You have been fighting because you are both afraid that stopping means losing, and losing means extinction. That fear has become the war. The actual resources you were fighting over became secondary before the first decade was finished." The room was very still. "You forgot something," she continued, and her voice carried neither accusation nor condescension, only the particular sadness of someone delivering a diagnosis they wish they didn't have to give. "Both of your species began the same way every species begins, afraid and alive and desperate to stay that way. That desperation is not weakness. It's a thing that brought you to the stars. But somewhere in the last 50 years, survival stopped being the goal. Destruction became the goal. You have been destroying each other in the name of surviving each other, and the difference between those two things is the entire distance between civilization and ruin." The Dresh Prime Coordinator, a vast distributed intelligence representing billions of linked minds, spoke through its designated voice construct. "You speak of our motivations as though you understand them. Your species is young. You have not seen what we have seen." "No," she agreed. "We haven't, but we've seen what's coming. The war machines you woke up, they are not the last of what you awaken if this continues. There are older things at the edges of this galaxy, things that have been dormant for epochs, and they respond to the same signal the drones responded to mass extinction events. You have been producing those events for 50 years. We have been watching the outer sensors. You have perhaps 3 years, possibly fewer, before something wakes up that your combined fleets and ours cannot stop. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. This was not the silence of shock or anger or diplomatic maneuvering. This was the silence of people receiving news they had, on some level, already known. "Then what do you want from us?" the Grand Coordinator asked. "To stop," she said. "That's all. Just to stop." They stopped. It was not clean or graceful or immediate. Peace never is. The formal ceasefire took 11 weeks to negotiate, with 17 near collapses and 3 incidents where weapons were raised before calmer voices prevailed. There were factions on both sides who had lost too much to accept survival as sufficient recompense. There were commanders who had built their entire identities on the architecture of the war and found themselves hollowed out by its absence. There were populations who had been taught for 2 generations that the enemy was an existential evil, and unlearning that lesson would take far longer than any diplomatic treaty could mandate. But the shooting stopped. That was the beginning. The human fleet remained, not occupying, not patrolling in any threatening sense, but present, quiet, watchful, and deeply informed. They knew where every active war machine dormant site was located. They knew which border flashpoints were most likely to reignite. They knew, with a precision that continued to unsettle both governments, exactly how fragile the peace was at every given moment. Wherever tension rose to a critical threshold, a human ship would appear, not threateningly, simply there, a reminder of what had been and what remained possible. Slowly, the galaxy began to breathe again. Refugee ships were guided home by human navigation assistants. Families separated across multiple star systems by the displacement of war were reunited through databases of humans that quietly maintained throughout the conflict, records of who had fled where, compiled during decades of observation. Trade routes were reopened, not all at once, but gradually, as trust was rebuilt in the incremental, imperfect way that trust always requires. Planets that had been cracked open were beyond repair. Some losses were simply permanent, and acknowledging that permanence without letting it reignite the war was perhaps the hardest thing either civilization had to do. The humans helped where they could. Where they couldn't, they sat with the grief and did not try to replace it with optimism. The observatory station became something unexpected, a permanent meeting place. Vaelthari and Dresh diplomats, scientists, and eventually ordinary citizens began coming there to exist in proximity to each other without weapons, which turned out to be the most radical act either civilization had attempted in half a century. Children who had been born on evacuation ships touched solid ground for the first time. 8 months after the ceasefire, the human fleet began to withdraw. They did not announce it grandly. There was no ceremony, no formal farewell address. Ships simply started disappearing from their patrol positions, one at a time, then in small groups, then faster. By the time either government had properly registered what was happening, the human presence had reduced from dozens of vessels to a handful, then to 3, then to 1. The last human ship held position at the center of the galaxy for exactly 1 standard day. Then it transmitted a final message. It reached every inhabited system simultaneously, as the first message had. But unlike the first, these were not 3 words. They were 2 sentences, and they landed differently in every language they were translated into, not because the translation varied, but because the meaning was so direct that no language could soften it. We watched you nearly destroy everything that has ever existed in this galaxy. Don't make us come back. Then the ship was gone. The question that haunted the galaxy in the years that followed was not whether humanity would return. It was why they had come at all. They had not demanded territory. They had taken nothing. They had asked for no formal recognition, signed no treaties as a party, established no embassies or trade agreements or military alliances. They had arrived, intervened, and departed as though the most advanced civilization in the known galaxy had spent decades of development for the sole purpose of stopping a war that wasn't theirs. Scholars from both civilizations spent years analyzing the question. Some argue that humanity had acted out of self-preservation, that the war machines, left unchecked, would have eventually spread to threaten human space as well. Others argued that the humans had been running a longer game, that apparent altruism was simply strategy with better optics. A few, mostly from younger generations who had grown up after the ceasefire, argued something that made their elders profoundly uncomfortable, that humanity had simply done it because it needed to be done, and they were the only ones who could. The Vaelthari Grand Coordinator, in a private journal published only after her death, wrote one line about the human intervention that was later quoted more than anything else she had ever said in her centuries of public life. They were the only species we had ever encountered who seemed more afraid of what they might become than of what might be done to them, and somehow that fear made them gentle. The war machines remained dormant. The ancient things of the galaxy's edge did not wake. The peace held, imperfectly, with setbacks and border tensions and moments where it seemed certain to collapse. But it held, and each time it nearly broke, someone would invoke the memory of 30 dark ships drifting silently between two armies, and the moment would pass. Humanity did not return, but the galaxy never quite forgot that they could. And on quiet nights, when new generations of Vaelthari children and Dresh youth and survivors of a dozen other species that the war had nearly erased looked up at the stars, they sometimes wondered about the beings from the small, unremarkable system on the outer spiral arm. The ones who had arrived with impossible ships and no weapons and 3 words that stopped the war. They wondered what humanity was doing out there in the dark. They wondered if humanity was still watching. They hoped, quietly, privately, in the particular way that people hope for things they are almost afraid to need, that the answer to both questions was yes. Because the galaxy had learned something in the silence after the guns went quiet. Something that no treaty could codify and no weapon could enforce. Something that lived now in the space between stars, in the pause before commander gives an order, in the moment a diplomat chooses words over weapons. The most powerful force in the universe was not a star-breaking torpedo or gravity well bomb, or a fleet of ships that could absorb any attack and disable any threat. It was a decision to stop. And somewhere out there, in the dark between the stars, humanity was still making it every single day, so that no one else would have to. The galaxy was dying, and it was doing so beautifully. Across the infinite dark, war fleets moved like storm clouds, their hulls blotting out the light of distant suns. Entire planets glowed amber and crimson as cities, centuries old, home to billions, vanished beneath orbital bombardment in minutes. The explosions were almost elegant from far enough away. Almost. Up close, they were the last thing millions of people ever saw. For 50 years, it had not stopped. 2 ancient superpowers, civilizations so old they had watched younger species crawl out of their oceans and reach for the stars, had locked themselves into a war that neither could win and neither could afford to lose. The Vaelthari, crystalline beings who had mapped the cosmos before most races discovered fire, stood on one side. The Dresh Collective, a hive intelligence that had survived 3 galactic extinctions through cold, perfect logic, stood on the other. They had fought over energy crystals found in the dying star system, a resource each believed would guarantee their survival for another 1,000 years. The first shots had been quiet. A border patrol ship vanishing. A listening station going dark. A trade convoy disappearing into the silence between stars. Then came retaliation. Then escalation. Then something that had no proper name except total war. Alliances formed and crumbled within seasons. Neutral systems, planets of artists and farmers and philosophers, were given a simple choice, join or burn. Many burned anyway. Ancient weapons, outlawed by Galactic Covenant for good reason, were uncrated and deployed without hesitation. Star-breaking torpedoes tore continents apart. Gravity well bombs collapsed the cores of inhabited moons. Artificial solar flares scorched the atmospheres of worlds that had sheltered life for millennia. The stars themselves were turned into weapons. And still, no one won. War factories replaced universities. Children were born aboard evacuation ships and grew up never having stood on solid ground. Generals fought brutal campaigns over systems that had already been emptied of all life worth fighting for. Resources once used to feed populations now fed weapon systems. The mathematics of destruction had become so routine that commanders stopped feeling the numbers. 1 billion casualties became a logistical footnote. But there was something worse happening, something that the warring factions, consumed by their hatred and their fear, had failed to notice until it was almost too late. Deep in the forgotten corners of the galaxy, in the ruins of civilizations erased by wars long past, something ancient was waking up. Automated war machines, Relics of conflict so old that the species who had built them no longer existed, were stirring in response to the vibrations of mass destruction. They did not have allegiances. They did not distinguish between Vaelthari crystal formations and Dresh neural colonies, between military fleets and refugee transports. Their programming was simple, brutal, and absolute. Destroy anything that moved. The war had stopped being a conflict between two powers. It had become something far more dangerous, a cascade, spreading outward, consuming, with no possible end except the death of everything. A few leaders, the ones who had been fighting long enough to see clearly, whispered the unspeakable truth to each other in private. If this continues, there will be no galaxy left to rule. No one listened. The war was too loud. On the edge of the largest active battle zone in the galaxy's history, several hundred warships from both factions sat in tense formation, weapons hot, shields blazing at full power. Commanders paced their bridges. Tactical officers reviewed kill vectors for the 1,000th time. Everyone waited for the signal that would send millions more to their deaths before the local star had completed a single rotation. The signal never came. Instead, something else did. At first, the sensor officers dismissed it as equipment malfunction, a reasonable assumption, given how much punishment the instruments had taken. A fleet had entered the combat zone, but not through any walk corridor, not along any established transit lane. There was no FTL signature, no approaching energy bloom. One moment the space between the two armadas was empty. The next, they were simply there, perhaps 30 ships in total, possibly fewer. The sensor data refused to agree with itself. The vessels were unlike anything in the Galactic registry. No faction markings, no known hull design. They were smooth and dark, their surfaces seeming to drink in the light around them rather than reflect it. They moved with an eerie, unhurried confidence, drifting slowly into the precise center of the combat zone, exactly between the two fleets, as though they had calculated the most dangerous possible position and chosen it deliberately. They did not form attack positions. They did not raise shields. They simply watched. Commanders across both fleets erupted into overlapping demands. Identify yourself. State your allegiance. You have 30 seconds to alter course before we consider you hostile. The hails went unanswered. Scanning beams were deployed, military grade, powerful enough to read the whole composition of a vessel on the far side of a planetary body. The beams passed through the unknown ships and returned readings that made no physical sense, as though the vessels existed only partially in observable space. Weapons locks engaged across 200 warships simultaneously. Then, one by one, they disengaged, not overridden, not jammed, simply released. Targeting systems went dark on their own, as if they had collectively decided that pointing weapons at these ships was not something they were willing to do. Panic spread faster than any weapons officer could contain it. Engineers ran diagnostics, systems that had functioned perfectly moments before returned errors they had never seen. There were no explanations. Then a transmission appeared.